Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
One of the greatest practitioners of what should be the noble art of journalism, Claude Cockburn, once said that when it comes to government information, nothing is true until it's officially been denied. The proper relationship, he said, between a journalist and the state should be the relationship of the dog to the lamppost. His dispatches from the Spanish Civil War were legendary. He founded The Week in 1933, studying standards in British journalism, which is still running today, though the standards are less. He fathered a family of great journalists, one of whom, Patrick Cockburn of the Independent newspaper in London, is this year's Foreign Correspondent of the Year, though, frankly, in my opinion, he is that every year. This week he wrote about our friends the Saudis and how they are paying for murder and mayhem in many parts of the world. I'm pleased to say he'll be joining us on board the Sputnik to discuss it. But first, the sea of hypocrisy which has engulfed the world following the demise of the freedom fighter, armed struggler, and my friend Nelson Mandela. Countries and even individuals who collaborated with the crime of apartheid to the nth degree have literally elbowed each other out of the way to get their selfies in at his funeral events, none more so than our own Prime Minister, David Cameron, who in his not-so-distant youth campaigned with the Federation of Conservative Students to hang Nelson Mandela. His leader, Margaret Thatcher, said that Mandela was a terrorist and that anyone who thought the ANC would ever rule South Africa was living in cloud cuckoo land. I was there. I heard her. I saw her lips move. We'll be joined shortly by the Pan-Africanist campaigner, Esther Stanford Kosai, who fights for reparations from the colonialist powers for the people of Africa. But first, Gayatri, if hypocrisy was the order of the day inside the Parliament, you were outside. What was it like there?
Outside, there were real people with real feelings.
Let's see.
Find it very hypocritical of the neocons who are now glorifying Thatcher and claiming unashamed Thatcherism when, until Mandela's death, it was forgotten that she occasionally took the wrong side of the fence position, calling Mandela a terrorist. She was with Pinochet. Have we forgotten these things?
The ANC used peaceful means up until the Sharpeville massacre, and when 69 people get innocently murdered, you've got to change your approach. And Mandela was a wholeheartedly good person, but at the end of the day, people don't realize what a brutal regime the apartheid regime was.
We continue his duty as he did to his country. We would like a good reconciliation after the Libyan civil war. So we would like all of Libyan parties take the path of the Nelson Mandela to bring everybody in Libya together to build our country.
Great stuff. Did I spot Mr. Blair's Middle East Minister, Peter Hain, in the crowd there?
Well spotted, and I managed to interview him as well.
Really?
I did.
Let's have a look at that then.
Mr. Hain, you know you've done a lot against the apartheid regime at the time. What are your memories of Mr. Nelson Mandela?
Nelson Mandela, for me, is somebody who went back to my childhood, because my parents were active in the anti-apartheid struggle in Pretoria in South Africa, in the dark, grim days of apartheid, the most evil system in the world at the time. And they were supporting him, and I remember him as a teenager, as a little boy. I remember his speech in his trial when he faced the death penalty, when he said that he would be prepared to die for his freedom and the freedom of his people. So for me, he's inspired my entire political life. Such a fantastic person because of his commitment to social justice, democracy and freedom.
So do you believe he realized his dreams?
Nelson Mandela was an idealist as well as a leader. He was somebody who showed fantastic courage, and he's probably the most admired political figure across the world. Universally admired, universally liked. And that is not just because of his courage and his leadership and the way he sacrificed the best days of his life in prison for the freedom of his people, it's because he's also a people's person. He cares about people, and I can remember countless times when he just was very, very nice to everybody he met, however important or unimportant they were.
How did you feel when you heard Prime Minister Cameron speaking, giving his condolences and speaking about Mandela, knowing his past, campaigning against him?
Well, there were some people who said they were against apartheid, and there were others who did something about it. The people who did something about it in the anti-apartheid movement, they have cause to be proud. And Nelson Mandela never failed to thank them. People in the anti-apartheid movement struggling for his freedom. He always used to say to us, without what you did, I would not be a free man today, and my people would not be free. Those who did not support the anti-apartheid struggle, those who either opposed it, as many did, including members of parliament here in Westminster, or those who did nothing, I don't think they can have any cause for pride at all.
Well, Peter Hain didn't answer the question of whether he thought Mandela's dreams had been realised. I think it's a fair bet that my next guest and myself don't consider that the mass of the South African people have had their dreams realised yet. Esther Stanford Kosai, am I right about that?
You're absolutely correct. The majority of Africans in South Africa have still been waiting for the promises of so-called democracy and freedom. And in fact, the freedom that they have enjoyed and the democracy that they have enjoyed post-1994 has really been a choiceless democracy. The land has still not been returned to the people. We're seeing increasing impoverishment. We're seeing many of the promises that the ANC made still not being delivered on.
It's good to have a vote, but you can't eat it. It's good to have freedom of speech and assembly and so on, but you can't live under it. It's not a roof. The discontent amongst the masses about the ANC government was evident, wasn't it, when the President of the Republic was roundly booed in the football stadium by the public who'd gathered for the Mandela Memorial.
That's correct, and that's just giving an indication of the feelings of the people, which are often suppressed in the mass media, because we are led to believe that we have this one happy family in South Africa, this rainbow nation, and it is really, it pays the powers that be who still maintain the wealth and the political power, the economic power, to create this mythology, to suppress the population into not resisting and not revolting. But that's no longer working.
The propaganda machine has airbrushed Mandela's life as a freedom fighter, as a political prisoner, as an ally of Cuba and the former Soviet Union, for example. All that's forgotten. And they are airbrushing the contemporary reality of South Africa, in which the mass of the population, whilst it's no longer subject to the crude vulgarities of apartheid, you don't get an official coming to measure the curls on your head to see which racial stratification you should be in, or telling you you can live in District 4 but not in District 6 and so on. But of course money is now causing the separate development. If apartheid means two different peoples living in the same country under entirely different conditions, well, apartheid hasn't ended.
No, it never ended. In fact, the economic apartheid always remained. And so it was well known when the ANC came to power in 1994. They did say they might be in government, but they're not in power. And that is exactly true. And we are saying the fact that, I mean, the whole economic situation is linked to the land crisis. There was a promise that there would be 30% redistribution of land by 2014. That target has now been pushed back to 2025. And it's well known that the commonest characteristic between those that have wealth and those that don't have it is the question of land and access to land, land use, land ownership, and also the ability to benefit from the institutions and everything that comes out of the land.
When you were vox-popping the public there, do you find any trace of the kind of disappointment that Esther and to some extent myself are expressing here?
Apart from the lady who was very pronounced about Thatcher's line, not really, because everybody there, young, old, black, white, they were just in the spirit of the good memories of Mandela.
It's a good thing that people love Mandela, and most people love him for the best of reasons, but it can also be a big, big coat of lipstick on the face of something that isn't quite so pretty.
Yes, I mean, I question what it is that people love about Mandela, because the imagery and the image making that we are seeing across the corporate mass media is of this saintly figure, this pacifist, this person who had this superhuman capacity for forgiveness. And that's actually quite interesting. And it reminds me of a comment that was made by a lord in the British House of Lords in 1996 in a debate on slavery and the question of reparations. And he actually said, well, bringing up this issue of reparations goes counter to the African humanity, because African people are actually quite forgiving. And so I don't see why we should be expected to be so forgiving. There's a question of justice, and justice still has not been realised.
It was quite interesting that President Obama got the best reception from the crowd at Mandela's memorial. He doesn't deserve it, in my view, but what was your take on that?
Mixed views about Obama, because Obama again represents this symbolism, a kind of symbolism that's akin to a Mandela, in terms of people feel enamoured of the fact that this is supposedly the first black president of America. But what people are not seeing is the role that he is playing as the head of US empire and military commander-in-chief. And so what it's also demonstrating is how people are not able to be discerning as to really what people's role is, and we get very much caught up in symbolism rather than the substance.
Esther Stanford-Kosai, thanks for joining us on Sputnik. We'll be back after the break talking about the tyranny in Saudi Arabia and Britain's peculiar love affair with it. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sputnik. Now, the Independent newspaper is one of Britain's better newspapers, and its foreign correspondents usually take first prize, and the very best of them is with me now here on the Sputnik. Patrick Coburn, thanks for joining us. You wrote a wonderful piece this week about the somewhat peculiar relationship between Britain and Saudi Arabia, indeed Western countries and Saudi Arabia, who, as you demonstrate in the piece, are responsible for and paying for extremism, sometimes of a very virulent kind, throughout the world, throughout the Muslim world. What's your conclusion as to why we should be in this peculiar relationship with them?
Well, it is very strange, as you say, since it's in plain view that the way that militant, fundamentalist, Sunni fanaticism has grown up really over the last 30 years has been through the support of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies. Yet the US and Britain have gone out of their way to pretend that somehow Iran is behind it or Iraq is behind it, while their own reports, as revealed in the 9/11 Commission and by WikiLeaks, say private donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf are the people who support Al-Qaeda and extreme Sunni organizations.
Well, the world was fixated this week when President Obama just shook the hand of the Cuban leader, Raul Castro, which is a country 90 miles away from his coast. But Western leaders are forever kissing the nose of the Saudi ruling elite and selling them guns.
You know, you look at Syria today, you know, who funds the insurgents? They were supported by Qatar until midsummer. Now Saudi Arabia has taken over the file, speaks of raising a substantial Sunni army that somehow will be against Assad, but will also be against Al-Qaeda, but yet Al-Qaeda-linked organizations seem to be part of it. So there's no question about their central role in funding fundamentalist, jihadi organizations from the 1980s, from the time of the Taliban in Afghanistan, the insurgents in Syria, Iraq. This record is obvious and pretty well undenied.
Well, as you put it in plain view, and it was ever thus, the fathers of the Taliban, the fathers of Al-Qaeda, indeed some of the founding members of Al-Qaeda, were initially paid for in Afghanistan by Saudi money, routed through Sadat's Egypt, on the orders of the American administration, with the British of Mrs. Thatcher close behind. But this seems to have survived the Al-Qaeda turn, which slaughtered thousands of Americans.
Yes, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, there is still part of the 9/11 Commission report, I think, which is to deal with Saudi Arabia, which hasn't been published. But why has it happened? I think one reason is that all these Al-Qaeda-linked organizations are primarily killing other Muslims. They're killing Shia, and if they're not killing other Muslims, they're killing Christians, Iraqi Christians, Syrian Christians. Suppose for a moment that they were killing people in Western Europe or in America. I don't think there'd be quite the same tolerant attitude towards these private donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf monarchies who are allowed to operate so freely.
I can understand why cynical Western politicians are prepared to avert their gaze from 9/11 and 7/7 in England, when 55 people were slaughtered on the London transport system. The Madrid bombings, where an even larger number were slaughtered. But the role of the media, you would have thought, would be to point out the inconsistency, hypocrisy of being in bed with Al-Qaeda, the same Al-Qaeda that sowed such carnage in our own countries.
I still find it amazing, because it's one of those stories which is very dramatic, but you don't have to dig for. You don't have to know some highly informed diplomat or have some secret source. I mean, it's been more perhaps patent through documents, released by WikiLeaks. There's a long memorandum from Hillary Clinton at the end of 2009 saying exactly the same thing as the 9/11 Commission had said 7 or 8 years earlier, that the people who support Al-Qaeda and the jihadi organizations are primarily donors in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. And there's no change in this, and not much is done about it. So it seems to me one of the great stories of the world, but largely uncovered.
Indeed. And I suppose the most obvious explanation is that we do very good business with Saudi Arabia. There's the endless recycling of Saudi petrodollars through London and New York and so on. But could it be that there is more to it than just brass? Could it be that, that Al-Qaeda is somehow a useful weapon in reserve for the big powers? I mean, they have been used in Syria in exactly that way.
It's all a bit like Afghanistan, I think, in a way, that there's a time when it's all okay to fund these very dangerous people, and then, surprise, surprise, you find that they don't like you very much, and they turn into some new form of Al-Qaeda.
Frankenstein, of course, thought he could build a monster and keep control of it, but the reason it's called a monster is because you can't keep control of it. But what's going to happen now? I think we agree that the war, though continuing to rage in Syria and blood continuing to flow, has turned decisively against Al-Qaeda and the fanatics. I think that Geneva 2 or 3 or 4 will ultimately bring about some kind of negotiated end to this conflict. But all these jihadis are dressed up with somewhere to go. Where might they go?
Well, some of them will come back and presumably won't have changed their views very much. They'll spread all over the place, like they did from Afghanistan. I think very late in the day, this has begun to worry Washington and London and Paris. But, you know, to my mind, surely it's too late, because you have hundreds and thousands of these people.
Well, that's a fact. The people in this country have been transfixed by the horror of what happened on a South London street a year or so ago, where an attempt was made to decapitate a young soldier in broad daylight in front of women and children by the very people that the British and other governments are supporting in Syria. If these fanatics had gone to Aleppo to commit such an atrocity, the British would have paid for the knife.
Well, yeah, they just, I'm not, you know, I don't think that they somehow, they don't associate supporting in general the rebels with the guys who are cutting throats in the streets of Aleppo. You know, last week they shot a guy, you know, who was he was selling diesel in Aleppo, and he described himself as the god of fuel, as an advertising slogan. They shot him for blasphemy immediately. You know, this is one of many stories. And so I think it's only now that the people are beginning in government to realize what a sort of Frankenstein, as you say, they've been allowing to develop in Syria and in northern Iraq. This is a great swathe of territory that is now under the control of Al-Qaeda. Despite everything, all these billions of dollars, these enormous security organizations established since 9/11, how come that Al-Qaeda, which used to be a very small organization, is now a very big organization and controls everything, or much of what happens between Mosul, a city in northern Iraq, and the Mediterranean? You know, this is an extraordinary development.
Especially as we were led to believe that upon the killing of bin Laden, that was more or less the end.
Yeah, that's what this was. But this is, you know, there's a phoniness about all this of we're combating Al-Qaeda. Where do we go? Do we go to northern Iraq, where they're very strong, northern Syria? No, we go to the hill villages of Yemen, you know, Bedouin encampments there, and have drone strikes. Or, you know, in North Waziristan. This is not where the action is. I mean, it's kind of easy to do there, and you can publicize great victories, but it's not where the serious battles are being fought, and it's not where the serious battles are being lost.
Patrick Cockburn, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the Sputnik.
Thank you so much.
Well, this is the part of the show where you have your say through our internet portal, RT_Sputnik, where the traffic is growing increasingly busier. What's new?
Well, this week on Twitter, I asked the people what they thought about the hypocrisy around the Nelson Mandela Memorial. And Alan Ainsworth said that Mr. Mandela must have been spinning in his grave. Zash Anna replies, bunch of thugs, murderers and war criminals. It is sad South Africa allowed so many war criminals to attend his funeral. Not up to him, of course. Crash the Market says, seeing Cameron at Nelson Mandela's funeral is on a par with Dennis Skinner faking grief at Thatcher's funeral.
Yeah, of course, Dennis Skinner would never have done that. David Cameron, however, did. David Cameron was a leading light in the Federation of Conservative Students, as was the Speaker, I may say, of the House of Commons, though he has sincerely repented. These people wore T-shirts with Mandela's face on them, saying, hang Nelson Mandela. I was there and saw them doing it. They campaigned, actually launched a paid-for campaign in support of apartheid, against sanctions on South Africa and for the hanging of Mandela. And yet there they are, shedding their crocodile tears over the great man's coffin. It's enough to turn your stomach, really. Yeah. What else have you got?
I got a few replies on the question how people think about the Saudi relation with Britain. And Rose replies to that, well, Queenie likes Saudi royals as well, doesn't she? Nice, cozy, brutality, abuse and arms sales. Lovely.
Well, I doubt that the Queen likes the Saudi royals, to be honest. But it's not properly appreciated overseas. The Queen makes none of these decisions. The Prime Minister tells the Queen who is coming to stay with her on any given Tuesday and who is to be wined and dined and taken down the streets of London in an open-top carriage.
David Thomas replies to the question why we have such a amicable relation with the Saudis. I'd pass that to our friends in the UK Arms and Trade to respond.
Well, undoubtedly, it's about arms sales in large part. Britain has sold tens of billions of pounds worth of weapons to a Saudi dictatorship that actually is incapable even of using them. They're probably rusting in the desert right now. It's a kind of recycling of the petrodollar. It's a kind of protection money. The Saudis get diplomatic and political support from Western countries, and in return, they spend all their money here.
Well, those were the best tweets of this week.
Well, that's all we've got time for, unfortunately. But if you enjoyed the Sputnik, come back next week at the same time.
Do please keep the tweets coming at RT_Sputnik. That's it from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.